The second hand made its rounds with the same stubborn confidence, clicking into place as if nothing in the room could ever interrupt it. A man at the far end of the table kept his eyes on that, not because he cared about the time, but because watching it gave him something to do that didn't require speaking. His fingers worried the edge of a folded paper, straightening it, creasing it again, smoothing it flat, until the fibers began to soften, until the act itself became a kind of quiet prayer. Somewhere behind a closed door, a telephone rang once and then stopped. No one moved. The air carried small, familiar sounds that felt too loud for how still everything else was. The faint hiss of a radiator, the slow drag of a chair leg as someone adjusted their weight, the soft scrape of a pencil turning in a match flared and died. The smell of smoke arrived a moment later, thin and hesitant, as if even it was unsure whether it was allowed to be. A lamp buzzed above the table, not flickering, not failing, only reminding everyone that it could. Its light pooled on the wood in a pale oval, catching dust in the air whenever someone breathed too deeply. He tried to breathe shallow. Across from him, a younger officer, too young to have learned how to look bored properly, kept glancing toward the same blank section of wall. Each time, his eyes returned to the table as though caught in the act. His boot tapped once, then again, then stopped, the way someone stops a habit when they become aware of it, as if the room had ears and would take offense. A pen cap clicked on and off, on and off. The rhythm was steady, almost comforting, until it wasn't, until it felt like counting. Someone coughed into their sleeve. Someone else cleared their throat and didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was crowded with things that had been said earlier and weren't being repeated. It was crowded with the way the men held their shoulders too square, with the way a hand hovered near a pocket and then thought better of it, with the way every face tried to look like it had accepted whatever was coming, even as their eyes betrayed the tiny, involuntary hope that something might still interrupt the schedule. A door opened somewhere down the corridor. Not here. Not yet. Footsteps passed, slowed, then continued. The sound faded like a thought being dismissed. He noticed, without wanting to, the little rituals that had formed in the waiting. A man checking his watch even though the wall clock was bigger. Another man wiping his glasses even though they were already clean. The clerk at the side desk aligning papers into a perfect stack, then aligning them again, as if order on paper could insist on order elsewhere. A small tin cup sat near the edge of the table, untouched. The tea inside it had long ago stopped steaming. A skin had formed on the surface, delicate and unbroken, like something pretending to be calm. Someone's sleeve brushed against a map that had been pushed aside. The paper shifted, a faint whisper of friction. Nobody looked at it. Nobody wanted to be the first to bring it back into the light, because bringing it back meant acknowledging the reason for the waiting, and waiting, this kind of waiting, was safer than naming anything at all. The clock clicked again, and again. The space between clicks felt longer than it should have, not because the clock was slowing, but because the men were listening now, listening as if the sound might change on its own, as if time itself might hesitate out of sympathy. It didn't. The younger officer ran a thumb along the seam of the table, tracing the same inch of wood twice, 3 times. The man who had been folding the paper finally stopped, holding it between both hands as though it might tremble if he let go. A low murmur drifted through the wall, voices in another room, indistinct, controlled. The kind of voices people use when they don't want the wrong sentence to be overheard. The murmur rose, then softened, then vanished. A pause followed, a deep one. Then, from somewhere nearer, the slow, deliberate turn of a knob. No one spoke. No one even looked at each other. They all watched the door the way you watch a fuse after the flame has found it. Still, focused, pretending there is time to decide what you'll do next. The latch shifted, and for the first time in what felt like hours, the room seemed to remember that time could. The door opened without urgency, as if the hand on the knob belonged to someone arriving for an ordinary meeting. It swung inward on patient hinges, revealing a sliver of corridor light that cut across the table like a blade laid down gently. A runner stepped in first, cap under one arm, cheeks bitten raw by cold air, eyes too bright from moving fast and stopping too suddenly. He held himself at attention with a kind of practiced stiffness, but his breathing hadn't caught up yet. He looked at no one directly. He looked at the space just above their shoulders, as if that was safer. Behind him came the smell of damp wool, and something metallic that clung to winter. Rail lines, wet stone, the faint sting of oil. No one asked where he'd come from. In a place like this, the distance was always implied. He handed a folded message to the senior man at the head of the table. Not ceremoniously, not with drama, like passing a tool, like placing a weight into someone else's hands so they could feel it for themselves. The senior man didn't open it right away. He let it sit on the table between his fingers. He pressed down on it as if checking for heat. The room held its breath around that paper. Outside the walls, the building continued its routines with stubborn devotion. Somewhere on another floor, a typewriter resumed its clatter. Short bursts, then silence, then more bursts, like someone hammering nails into a crate. A telephone rang again, answered this time with a sharp lift of the receiver, followed by a voice kept low. Boots passed in the hallway, their rhythm unhurried, and then the sound of a cart being pushed, wheels complaining softly across stone. Normal sounds, office sounds, but each one landed differently now, as if they had shifted position while no one was looking. The senior man finally unfolded the message. The paper cracked faintly at the crease. His eyes moved across it with the calm of someone reading something he already expects. The only change in his face was so slight it could have been imagined, an almost imperceptible tightening near the jaw, a small pause at the end of a line. He folded it again with care. He did not announce anything. Instead, he placed the paper beside the map that had been ignored. He tapped the map once, not hard, just enough to claim it back from the edge of the table, just enough to admit it belonged here. Chairs shifted, men straightened. A pencil that had been rolling stopped under a palm. The younger officer ceased his glancing and fixed his eyes forward like a boy called on in school. In the corner, the clerk reached for a notebook, flipped to a blank page, and steadied his hand as though preparing to catch what might fall. The senior man spoke at last, and his voice was not raised. It had the tone of someone giving directions to a driver. Simple, precise, leaving no room for questions that wouldn't be answered. "We'll proceed as planned." That sentence hung in the air like a curtain drawn. No one challenged it. No one asked what planned meant, because they all already lived inside that plan. It had been in their pockets for days, in their sleep, in the way they ate their meals too quickly and kept their coats on indoors. The plan was in the ink drying on forms, in the fuel tallies, in the coded phrases spoken into telephone, in the crates that had been loaded and relabeled and loaded again. The plan had become its own kind of normal. A man on the left side of the table leaned in, careful not to touch the map with his sleeve. His fingernail traced a route without leaving a mark, following lines that looked clean and reasonable on paper. He paused at an intersection, as if waiting for the map to object. It didn't. Somewhere in the building, a radiator knocked once. A small metallic complaint. The clerk wrote something down anyway. The senior man glanced at his watch. He did it casually, but the act changed the time was no longer something that happened. It was something they were now tracking, measuring, budgeting. A second message arrived 10 minutes later, carried by a different runner. This one older, with a face built for endurance rather than speed. His fingers were stained faintly with ink, his hands trembling not from fear but from cold. He delivered the envelope and left without being dismissed. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt more intentional than before. The envelope was opened. The contents were read. Nothing was spoken aloud, only a nod. Across the table, a man who had said nothing so far reached for a cigarette. He slid it from the pack with deliberate slowness, set it between his lips, and held the match in his hand without striking it, as if he were waiting for permission from the room itself. The senior man didn't look at him, but he said, "Not here." The cigarette was put away. The match disappeared into a pocket. Small controls, tiny assertions of order. It was how they kept the world from feeling like it was slipping. In another room, far enough away that the voices were muffled, but close enough that their cadence could be felt, a group of men argued briefly. Not in anger, in procedure, the kind of argument that still assumes there will be time to correct something. Then silence. Then a chair scraped back. And in the corridor beyond the door, someone laughed once. An abrupt, startled sound, immediately swallowed. A laugh that tried to pretend this was still an ordinary day with ordinary mistakes. The younger officer at the table blinked harder than he needed to. He shifted his posture and laid both hands flat on his thighs, the way someone does when they're trying to keep their hands from showing what they're doing. A man near the window checked the curtain and let it fall back into place. Outside, the light had a watery quality, gray and thin. No sun, just day. The senior man began assigning tasks in a measured tone, each instruction landing like a stamp on paper. Names were spoken, times were referenced, rooms were mentioned, lines of communication repeated twice, as if repetition could make the wires more reliable. A courier would leave within the hour. A confirmation would be expected by evening. A certain unit would be ready by nightfall. Ready. A word that sounded clean until you listened to it too closely. The clerk wrote continuously now, his pencil moving with a soft urgency that didn't match the calm in the voices. Every few seconds he paused, not because he didn't understand, but because his mind needed a fraction of time to accept that these were real instructions being set into motion. The map was pulled closer, and the men leaned over it as if it were a hearth in winter. They studied it with the same patient attention you'd give to a clock you couldn't slow down. Outside the room, normal life persisted in fragments. A distant radio played a thin, tinny melody from an office down the hall. Someone smelled faintly of bread, as if they had passed a bakery. A janitor's mop bucket squeaked along the corridor, and for a moment the sound felt insultingly domestic. Someone, somewhere, was washing a floor. Someone, somewhere, was refilling a kettle. The world kept doing what it did. Inside the room, the men kept speaking as though their words were still just words, as though paper and ink and telephone lines were all that separated routine from consequence. And through it all, the clock continued its patient clicking, steady, faithful, untroubled, counting down towards something none of them would name, even as they began to move everything toward it. The first irregularity arrived quietly, the way flaws often do, so small it could pass for imagination. It was a delay, nothing dramatic, nothing worth interrupting the flow of the room, just a message that took longer than expected to return, a confirmation that did not come back on the first line, or the second. The operator lifted the receiver, waited, replaced it, and tried again with the same careful patience she used every day. Her voice stayed even, her posture did not change. "Line's busy," she said, to no one in particular. Busy was an acceptable word. Busy meant alive. Busy meant working. So they waited. The senior man adjusted the cuff of his coat, smoothing a wrinkle that had not been there before. He glanced at the clock and then away, as if refusing to acknowledge the meaning of them. Across the table, someone cleared his throat and asked whether the courier had already left. He had. That, at least, was certain. Paper continued to move. Files were opened and closed. A stamp came down on a document with a dull, authoritative thud. Ink dried. The second irregularity came disguised as a correction. A figure on a sheet of calculations was crossed out and replaced with another, only slightly different. No one argued. The margin note was written smaller than usual, as if to avoid drawing attention. The clerk hesitated before copying it into the log, then did so anyway, telling himself that revisions were part of the work. They always had been. Someone joked, briefly, about the cold. It earned a few thin smiles. The room accepted the joke like a kindness, something to keep the air from tightening too much. In the corridor, a runner passed at a quicker pace than necessary. His boots struck the floor harder than before. He didn't enter. He didn't stop. He simply went by, the sound lingering after him like a question that chose not to be asked. A map was turned 90 degrees and then turned back. A finger traced a boundary line twice, slower the second time. A man frowned, not deeply, not long enough to require comment, and then nodded, as if the map had reassured him. "Within tolerance," he said softly. Tolerance was another good word. Tolerance suggested flexibility. It suggested that systems were built with room for error. The radio in the adjacent room crackled once and then settled. The operator leaned closer to it, listening for something more. Nothing followed. She straightened and made a small note in pencil, the kind of note that could later be erased. Time stretched. The younger officer was sent to retrieve a file from an upper floor. He returned later than expected, apologizing under his breath for the delay. He said someone had stopped him on the stairs with a question. He did not say what the question was. No one pressed him. The file he carried was warm from being held too tightly. It was heavier than it looked. When it was opened, the pages inside gave off the faint smell of damp paper, as if they had been stored somewhere less dry than planned. "Still usable," someone said. They kept going. Outside, the light shifted almost imperceptibly, not darker, just flatter. The kind of light that made windows look like they were filled with smoke rather than sky. A telephone rang. This time, the sound made several heads lift at once. The receiver was picked up immediately. "Yes," the operator said. Then, after a pause, "Yes, I understand." She listened longer than before. When she replaced the receiver, she did not sit down right away. "There's interference," she said. "They'll try again." Interference happened. Everyone knew that. Weather, distance, old lines. It didn't require alarm. But someone asked carefully whether the alternate line had been tested. "It was this morning," she replied. Morning already felt distant. The senior man made a small mark on the schedule, adjusting a time window by a few minutes. He did it without comment, as if it were nothing more than tidying. Another message arrived. This one typed rather than handwritten. The paper was clean. The words were precise. They confirmed what was already assumed, except for one sentence near the end that required reading twice to be sure it said what it said. No one mentioned that sentence. The man holding the paper folded it once, then again. Aligning the edges carefully, he placed it on top of the others, where it disappeared into the stack. In the corner, The clerk paused in his writing and flexed his fingers. His hand ached. He told himself it was from working too long, nothing more. He resumed. A pot of coffee was brought in by someone whose name no one remembered. The cups were filled. The coffee was bitter and thin. It did its job anyway. Steam rose briefly, then vanished, leaving the cups looking cold again almost immediately. Someone noticed, quietly, that a unit referenced earlier had not checked in on schedule. "They'll report soon," another replied. "They always do." Always was a word built on memory, not on the present. A runner arrived and left within seconds, exchanging a glance with the senior man that carried no expression at all. A nod. Nothing more. The door closed. The younger officer watched the door a moment longer than necessary. The clock marked another interval. The sound felt sharper now, as if the room had grown thinner around it. Outside, a vehicle backfired. The noise echoed briefly and then dissolved. No one reacted. Not because they weren't startled, but because reacting would have meant admitting that they were listening for worse sounds. The map was rolled up partway, and then unrolled again. Someone realized they had misread a notation earlier. It was corrected without comment. "Doesn't change anything," the man said. And perhaps it didn't. Not yet. The operator tried the line again. This time she listened longer, her brow tightening slightly before smoothing itself away. "Still busy," she said. The senior man nodded. "We'll proceed." Proceeding had become reflexive now, like breathing. A chair scraped softly as someone leaned back, stretching muscles stiff from hours of stillness. He glanced at the ceiling, counting cracks, then lowered his gaze again. His foot tapped once, then stopped. In another part of the building, a bell rang to mark the hour. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound threaded its way into the room and settled there, unwelcome, but undeniable. An hour gone. Nothing had happened, and yet the room felt heavier, as if something invisible had been added to the air, something no one could point to, something no one wanted to name. They continued talking. They continued adjusting. They continued behaving as though the systems they trusted were still intact, still responsive, still listening. Outside, the day moved on. Inside, the signs accumulated. Small, polite, easily dismissed, waiting for someone to decide they mattered. No one did. The window narrowed without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. It wasn't announced. There was no signal to mark it. Just a gradual tightening, the way daylight seems to shorten in winter, not by minutes, but by feeling. The senior man stood for the first time in hours. The movement drew every eye in the room, not because it was dramatic, but because it broke a rhythm that had become protective. He walked to the window, stopped just short of touching the glass, and looked out at nothing in particular. "The courier should have reached the exchange by now," he said calmly. "Should have" was spoken lightly, as if it were still flexible. A subordinate checked his watch. He did not say what he saw on its face. Instead, he adjusted the strap and nodded, as though agreeing with the room rather than the time. The operator tried the line again. This time, there was a faint sound on the other end. Not a voice, not silence, something between. She held the receiver tighter, as if pressure might clarify it. "Stand by," she said into the mouthpiece, then waited. Her shoulders stiffened, then relaxed. She replaced the receiver carefully. Still no clear connection. No one reacted. They had passed the point where reacting to each interruption would have exhausted them. Instead, they absorbed it, added it to the growing weight of things being carried without complaint. A messenger arrived with a correction to an earlier instruction. It was minor. A different route. A revised time window. The senior man read it, frowned slightly, then initialed the margin. "Make the adjustment," he said. There was a pause, short, almost imperceptible, before someone asked whether the adjustment affected anything else. "No," he replied too quickly. Then, after a breath, "It shouldn't." Shouldn't was not the same as wouldn't. The map came out again. This time it was spread fully, corners weighted with small objects that had been within reach. An ashtray, a paperweight, a closed notebook. Hands hovered over it, careful not to smudge the ink, careful not to disturb the illusion that it was still an abstract thing. One man traced a line and stopped halfway, his finger suspended. "If there's a delay here," he said quietly, "it narrows the margin." The word margin landed heavier than expected. "How much?" someone asked. The man withdrew his hand. "Not much." Not much was acceptable. Not much was survivable. The younger officer shifted in his chair. He opened his mouth, closed it, then leaned forward slightly, as if bracing himself against the table. "There was something on the stairs earlier," he said carefully. "Just talk." But, the senior man prompted without turning. The younger officer hesitated. He felt every eye on him now, not accusing, just waiting. "They're moving faster than expected," he finished. "Down below." No one asked who they were. Everyone knew. The senior man nodded once. That's accounted for. The answer was technically correct. Somewhere in the paperwork, somewhere in the assumptions, it had been accounted for. The problem was that paper did not move at the same speed as people. The clock ticked. Someone suggested a brief pause, 10 minutes maybe, to let information catch up with motion. The suggestion was framed casually, like a courtesy. The senior man considered it. The room leaned inward, collectively. If we pause now, he said, we compress everything that follows. He didn't say what followed. And if we don't? Someone asked. The senior man didn't answer immediately. He returned to his chair and sat down, aligning his papers as he did so. Then we stay on schedule, he said. Schedule had become a shelter. As long as they stayed inside it, they didn't have to confront what lay outside. The operator received a partial transmission at last. It was brief, fragmented. She wrote down what she could, her pencil moving quickly, decisively. When she read it aloud, the words sounded thinner than they should have. Incomplete. Is that all? Someone asked. That's all there was. Can they resend? They said they would. Another pause. Another small stretch of time placed under strain. A man near the wall stood and paced 3 steps before stopping himself. He returned to his chair and sat rigidly, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the map. Outside, a low rumble passed through the air. Not close, not distant. Something large moving somewhere else. It faded before anyone could be sure what it was. The senior man glanced at the clock again. This time he didn't look away immediately. We still have a window, he said. Narrow, but usable. Usable for what was not said. A junior clerk entered with a question about documentation timing. He was answered gently, efficiently, sent away with a reassuring nod. The door closed behind him, sealing the room again. The younger officer looked at the senior man, then at the map, then at his own hands. If we needed to stop it, he said, choosing his words with care, this would be when we'd have to decide. The sentence was soft, almost respectful. The senior man finally looked at him. We're not stopping, he said. Not harshly, not dismissively, simply stating a condition, the way one states the weather. The younger officer nodded. He had said his piece. The room accepted that as resolution enough. The operator checked the line one more time. Nothing. The clock advanced. Outside, the light dimmed another degree, slipping toward evening. Inside, lamps were turned on, one by one, without comment. The final window was closing. Not with a slam, not with a warning, but with the quiet inevitability of a door that only opens one way. And still, everything felt ordinary enough to continue. It was a form. That was all it was. A single sheet pulled from the middle of a folder, thinner than most of the documents that had already passed across the table. That its edges were crisp, untouched by revisions or notes. It bore no dramatic markings, no urgent language, just a set of boxes, a sequence of lines, and a space at the bottom where authorization was expected to. The senior man placed it flat before him and aligned it with the table's edge. He did not rush. He did not sigh. He took the pen from beside his papers and held it loosely, as if testing its weight. No one spoke. The room seemed to recognize the object before understanding it. Conversations trailed off. Chairs stopped shifting. Even the clock's clicking felt less present, as though sound itself had stepped back to watch. What's the timestamp? Someone asked quietly. Not challenging, just confirming. The clerk leaned forward, squinting slightly. It locks the sequence, he said. Once it's logged, the earlier orders stand. Stand was a neutral word. It carried no emotion. It didn't suggest harm or consequence. It suggested stability. The senior man nodded once. Outside the building, something heavy passed again. Vehicles this time, moving with purpose. The vibration was faint, more felt than heard, but it traveled through the floor and settled in the bones. A few men shifted unconsciously, adjusting their balance. The operator opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced at the receiver, then away, as if she could feel it watching her. There's still no confirmation from the exchange, she said finally. The senior man didn't look up. They'll follow the schedule we sent. That schedule assumes, she began, then stopped herself. The room waited. She swallowed. It assumes receipt. The pen hovered above the paper now, its tip close enough to cast a tiny shadow. We've done everything required to ensure receipt, the senior man said. His voice was calm, procedural. We can't account for every delay. No one argued. Accounting for every delay would have meant acknowledging how many had already slipped past unnoticed. The younger officer leaned forward again. He had been doing that more often lately, inching closer to the table without realizing it, like someone drawn toward heat. If we wait, he said carefully, just a little longer. The senior man finally met his eyes. If we wait, he said, this document becomes irrelevant. Irrelevant was worse than wrong. Irrelevant meant lost control. The younger officer nodded. He leaned back, the movement slow, deliberate, as if he were placing distance between himself and the thought that had almost made it in words. The clerk cleared his throat. "Once it's logged," he said, "the sequence can't be reversed without issuing a counter-order." "How long does that take?" someone asked. "Longer than we have," the clerk replied. The pen touched the paper. It made a sound, barely audible, a soft scratch that seemed too small to matter. The senior man signed his name without flourish, the letters neat, practiced, unremarkable. He lifted the pen, blew gently on the ink out of habit, and capped it. No one moved. The clerk reached for the form, hesitated for half a second, then took it. He stamped it with the date and time. The stamp came down firmly, final. Ink spread slightly at the edges, bleeding just enough to look permanent. He logged it into the book with careful precision, writing slower than usual, aware that speed would not improve anything now. "Logged," he said. That was it. No alarm sounded, no lights changed, no doors slammed or phones rang in response. The room remained intact, obediently quiet, as if nothing of significance had occurred. Outside, the vehicles continued moving. Somewhere else, men who had never seen this room adjusted their own watches and followed instructions that now had weight behind them. The operator tried the line one last time. This time, there was nothing at all, not even interference. She replaced the receiver and folded her hand. The senior man gathered the remaining papers and stacked them neatly, squaring the edges with the table. He pushed the map aside, rolling it up with care, as if protecting it from damage. "We proceed," he said. The phrase no longer felt like a choice. The younger officer stared at the blank space where the form had been. He imagined, briefly, what it would look like undone. Ink lifted from paper, time rewound by minutes. The thought did not linger. It had nowhere to go. The clock continued its work. Somewhere deep within the building, a mechanism engaged. A low, distant sound, steady and patient. It was the kind of noise that usually went unnoticed, part of the infrastructure, part of how things functioned. But now it carried a different weight, not because it was louder, but because it would not stop. The line had been crossed without ceremony, and nothing remained in the room that could cross it back. The room went quiet in a way that felt intentional, not the quiet of waiting for instructions, or the quiet of men thinking. This was different. This was the quiet that follows completion, when there is nothing left to prepare and nothing left to adjust. Someone turned off a lamp. No one remembered deciding to do it. The light simply vanished from one corner of the room, leaving a softer, flatter glow behind. Shadows rearranged themselves without urgency. The senior man remained seated. He did not check his watch again. He did not need. Time had moved beyond his supervision. The operator sat with her hands folded, eyes on the telephone as if it might ring out of habit alone. It didn't. The receiver rested heavily in its cradle, inert, finished with its part. A clerk closed the ledger and slid it into a drawer. The drawer shut with a muted click, sealing away the last written proof that decisions had been made at all. No one spoke. Outside, the building exhaled its usual sounds. Pipes shifting, distant footsteps, a door closing somewhere far below. Ordinary noises, continuing out of loyalty to routine. The younger officer stood and walked to the window. He didn't look down. He looked straight ahead, at the pale stretch of sky pressed flat against the glass. His reflection hovered faintly there, overlapping the world beyond. He placed his palm against the window, not hard, just enough to feel the cold. For a moment, he imagined that somewhere else, somewhere connected by lines and orders and schedules, people were pausing too. That they might be standing still, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. The thought was comforting, even if he knew it was unlikely. Behind him, a chair scraped softly as someone adjusted their position. A coat was lifted from the back of another chair and folded over an arm. Preparations for leaving, though no one said they were done. The senior man finally stood. He gathered his coat and put it on with deliberate care, straightening the collar, buttoning it properly. He looked around the room once, not searching, not reflective, just acknowledging its presence, as one acknowledges a place that has served its purpose. "We'll reconvene when necessary," he said. Necessary would come on its own. The door opened. Corridor lights spilled in again, thinner now, tinged with evening. One by one, the men filed out, their footsteps measured, their expressions composed. They did not hurry. There was nothing left to outrun. The operator left last. She paused at the doorway and glanced back at the telephone, as if checking whether she had forgotten something. She hadn't. She turned off the remaining lamp and closed the door behind her. The room fell into stillness. Outside, the sky darkened another shade. Somewhere far beyond this building, mechanisms continued their patient work, following paths that had already been cleared for them. Nothing had happened yet, but everything that would happen was already on its way. And the moment just before impact, silent, suspended, irreversible, held its breath and did not let go.